Opacity and blur can be used as a stylistic option to kind of create some distance between background elements and foreground elements. It can be used as a style where you have faded backgrounds, or you're trying to separate like a modal raising off of a background. And it can also enhance contrast and provide different styling opportunities. So there's lots and lots of things that can be done with opacity and blur. I would say blur is more of an enhanced opacity that was introduced with one of the latest versions of iOS. But we're gonna take a look at a lot of different examples, kind of get into a live editing session here. So let's just jump right into Figma here. We've got some opacity examples and some blur examples we're gonna run through. And I've shared this before, but it's worth noting again, especially for different color avatars. Let's say we have an avatar and I've got my plugin, so I'm just gonna pop this in. So let's go ahead and create a inner stroke. And then on the opacity of this inner stroke, give it a 10% range. Okay, so that's a really, really easy way to use opacity for avatar borders. And a lot of times that might not even show up, but you can tell if you have this lighter edge up against that white, it won't always work out if you don't have that. So sometimes it's fine. And again, these are all stylistic decisions, but we're just gonna randomly pull some more in here. See, on the darker one, you can barely even see it. But then on these, it shows up a lot more because they have this white background. So let's do avatar on these. There's a stroke right here with the border, and it just kind of gives that just enough little bit of a pop. And you can play around with a darker border, but generally speaking, you're gonna be good in the kind of 10% range. And you may have 2 pixel stroke. You could also do this with the opacity of an inner shadow as well. As long as your y-axis is at 0, it'll just kind of all come in together and it won't be shifted one way or the other. So that would be another way to do it with an inner shadow. If you wanted to be a little bit more discreet without a full hard edge stroke, you could kind of achieve that same effect. But then again, these look a little bit set back. So again, it's a stylistic preference for the opacity and however you want to use it. Another great way to use opacity is for background overlays. So let's just give ourselves a big rectangle here. I'm gonna pull in an unsplash photo and let's bring in some architecture. Maybe let's get one that's a little bit lighter. So let's say this is not the greatest photo, actually. Let's do one more. Trying to get one that needs a little bit of background transparency love. Okay, this is a decent one, I guess. I'm not exactly sure what kind of foot that is, but we're gonna go with it. Is that a camel? I don't know. I think it's a camel. So let's say that we have a big background images. Camels are awesome. We're trying to create this header, and this is the photo that we were supposed to use. And let's say we're gonna try to make this a big thing. Camels are awesome. Or maybe awesome camels has a better ring to it. So we could try white text, but you can never know. The white text looks much better on top of the dark background. And then maybe it gets washed out a little bit more like this. Bring that in a little. So a very, very easy way is just to add an opacity. You can do a gradient, or you could do just this solid, start off with full black, and maybe you go 90, 80%, something like right in there is a way that you can create a little bit more contrast. I'm gonna duplicate this, and sometimes it's easier to have the opacity on its own layer, so you have 2 separate objects. That way you can control, maybe it's a little floating tile that you use in a different kind of way. So this is not the most incredibly designed example, but it just kind of gives you the idea that you can use these opacities as their own little elements, as kind of background overlays. You can experiment with different colors. You can use white with black text. So it's just an easy way to create a bit of a contrast when you need it. The other example of this would be, so say we clicked on an item and we have a background modal that pops up. Maybe it's an email form or some kind of alert. And let's say we put a smooth shadow on that thing and it looks pretty decent. Maybe we have a button here and some text. I'm not really gonna design this fully out because I just wanna bring in the example. Move this down a bit. So there's our example, kind of a poorly designed text box example. We'll give this a little bit more love on the button just so it looks a bit more like a button. So if we're on top of an image, this looks okay, but sometimes the background can be quite distracting. So the same way that we're using this background for the text overlay, we can also pretty easily just create this overlay over the entire image. I'm just gonna send this down the layered area, and then we can bring in maybe a 60% black. You can create any color, any opacity for these background overlays. And again, it's a stylistic decision. Maybe your overlays are standard kind of 70, 50. You can kind of play with the range of that overlay that you're going to use. And it could even be white. Maybe it's kind of washed out or it's a little bit of a gray. You can kind of use your brand colors or use your structural color palette to kind of inform the way that you're gonna create this overlay. And sometimes it can create a really nice effect, especially if maybe you want this really light background and the dark looks a little bit too harsh. It's kind of up to you to use these overlays to separate the content and kind of create this environment for your interface to live. And unpredictable backgrounds. I think this is, let's see, do we have a floating or fixed elements? This is kind of the same thing as what we have right here. This image is an unpredictable background. So if we went and we kind of changed this back out, unpredictable. Let's go a little smaller there and change the resizing. Just gonna kind of tighten this up a little bit. There we go, 20 all the way around. So I'm gonna group these two things. And what if this was like a little tag? And maybe this is a little bit of a blur, say 80% blur. Well, now any photograph that we put in here is actually going to work because we have this black background and it's only letting a tiny bit of white come through or light from the photograph. So it doesn't matter if this is a full white background, it's still going to work. And you can still check your transparency on a full white background. And you can see you're gonna have a very good contrast testing that on a white background. But any photograph that you put in here is going to work to a certain extent. I mean, the composition for some photos might be a little different and you may need to change your composition and your layout based on a photograph. But in terms of just having readable text on top of a photograph, this is a great way to do it. And you can also have this stuff can be interactive. You know, if this is like a caption, you may not want to hide captions by default, but you can always kind of, maybe a better example would be grabbing one of these avatars and say this is your profile page. And then I think I have some cursors that I can bring in. Cursors, is that a library that I have? Cursor, we want to activate our cursors. Then I can bring this over to make it look like it's hovering. And so this might be the default state, and this one may have again a very simple, solid little hover gradient over, or not gradient. This might have an opacity, and let's grab an icon from our feather pack. Let's do a pencil or a camera maybe. A camera will be better. Okay. We're going to make this white. So there we go. I'm going to center that in there. So again, very simple way to create this hover effect. Maybe this is editing your profile photo on whatever platform you're on, and maybe on mobile you're not going to have hover effects, so you have to be careful with explicitly saying certain things on mobile versus desktop. But on desktop experiences, you're quite often going to have the hover effect, and so this all could very well just kind of fade out as one object here. There we go. So that you could imagine if that was the hover effect right there. Just a really easy way to separate that content. If you want to layer things, the opacity, background opacity, it's just going to be a great way to separate that content. So let's do the map sickle plugin, and we'll just paste in this map right here. Now again, for floating or fixed elements, the same kind of way we did this, I'll actually just copy and paste this over here because it's really kind of a similar idea. Say we had some kind of map controls, and oops, that was the wrong one. Let's do feather real quick. I don't always only use feather icons, but in the interest of speed for these lessons, I am. So let's see, location. Let's say we want to pop this thing in, and we want to make this white. So I can just pull, whoops, I'm pulling it through a frame. Let's get that out of a frame, paste that in my group. Maybe this is more like 24 by 24 to match the dimensions of this, and then I can go a little bit larger. There we go. And maybe I want to put some corner radius on this thing. Put this right in here. 40 from there. So again, no matter what map we're using here, this overlay is going to work nicely. And you can experiment with 90%. I mean, full black could work. It depends on the style and the direction that you're going for. But you're going to be better off staying in the 80 to 90% range on some of this stuff. And text opacity on colored background. So let's just say let's actually add in a gradient here just for a better effect. Let's go with our blue to purple kind of gradient. We'll keep this at 100%. And let's give it a little, there we go. And let's say this is like a subheading at like 16, maybe 14 pixels. Center that. Maybe this is regular, medium. Let's do medium. So if we want to kind of de-emphasize this area, and honestly, even if we have the exact same style for two different pieces of text, so we can just add a little opacity on this to de-emphasize that bottom text, and it's going to suck in that background color no matter what it is. So you can see that, okay, I put this at 60. We could do 70 or 80 as well. 60 seems to work well for now. And then if I go and change the gradient, let's go to HSB so we can watch our slider happen. We'll go with like a little bit darker color. So no matter what color we go to, it's gonna pull in that same color because of the text opacity. And you do have to be careful with opacity and text opacity because you can never fully predict if this is gonna pass contrast or not. So you can see this one's starting to fail, and a lot of times you might actually need to pick that HSB value and really lock into a fully 100% hex code value or HSB value. But the opacity to start with will give you a nice starting point. And sometimes if your 60% is too low, then you can bump it up to 70 and then retest on that particular gradient. You just have to be careful because this will, depending on the background, this is going to start to fail in certain instances, whereas this one would always pass because it's a fixed opacity background that it's not going to change depending on the background. When you don't have that background, it's a little bit more dynamic. That is definitely a little bit more susceptible to a contrast problem. But not to say that you can't use it. It's just you have to be a little bit more careful with it. All right, so the blur, I think, is almost like an extra icing on top of all this. So I'm gonna bring some of these frames down here to kind of continue to explore the idea of what a blur can do. So we're gonna look at a Gaussian blur would be kind of grabbing this whole image here and adding an effect and putting this, in Figma it's called layer blur. And then you can really crank up the blur to give it this interesting effect like this. So that is very similar to the idea of putting on a background overlay, but it just kind of creates a different style. And again, direction is your app, is your project, is your website, a website that's going to use blurry images as backgrounds. These are some of the things that you need to explore and decide on before you just kind of start going wild with blurs. But you can mix the blurry background image and the overlay together. So if I put a solid color on here, the black again, and then I'm gonna go to 0%, and then I might just do a 10, 20, 30, because you don't need quite as strong of an overlay like you do here. You can see like a 20% overlay on this. That actually still looks okay. But that might be too dark on this. So maybe you just do a 10% and you get a similar effect because of that blurry image. And it's definitely more of a stylistic preference. And okay, so background blur. So that would be an idea of Gaussian blur. So if I pull this one over here again, and let's just mix this up, different colors, just so we have some variety in here. Let's go ahead and grab ourselves a different unsplash image. And I'm actually gonna take this layer blur off. So unsplash, let's do a plant. There we go, that one's pretty nice. So let's say we wanna play around with the background blur. So let's grab the background of this modal. Now this is a very iOS type of thing. So I am going to put on one more drop shadow or effect rather. I'm going to change this to background blur. And you can tell nothing's really happening right now because I'm blurring the background, but there's no opacity. So what I really need to do is change the fill on this a little bit. And I'm going to remove these shadows just so we don't get too mixed up. Now that I have this let me put it at 10% just so you can see a little bit more of a dramatic, see what's happening. So the background blur is going to do just what you think. It's going to blur everything in the background of that image. And since these look a little bit weird on that background blur, I'm going to use my opacity trick on just these blocks just so they bring in a little bit more of that color. So now I can play with my background blur, and you can really crank it up, but sometimes it might be nice to keep a little bit of. So if I go too high, I'm starting to lose a little bit more of that background image. So like right at 30 or so, you can play with this. It's a stylistic preference type of thing. But then maybe you bring in a little bit of white, and maybe that looks too muddy. So maybe you go to this a black opacity, and you add in 20%, reduce the blur to 20. Maybe you bump this up a little. You could even use the same blue color, go to your HSB range, and then just make the brightness a little bit darker. But then you'd have to change you always have to change the fill at least to 90 or 80% to get that blur effect to work. But you can tell because I went with that more medium blue color, now I can go a little bit lower with my opacity. And I can still get it to kind of have a nice effect. And I'm gonna bump that up, make it look a little bit more like a title. And now you can also go in now and add a shadow back to this thing if you have it like you like. Actually, the shadow is, I think the shadow plugin killed my background blur. So what I'm gonna do is copy the background blur, selected it right here, hit Command C, and then I'm gonna do smooth shadow again, and then apply it, and now I'm just gonna hit Command V to paste that background blur back on. So now, if I take this off, you can see that shadow being cast. And actually it even creates a kind of an interesting color here as well with the blur. But again, go back in, maybe you want this a little darker. So there's different ways you can play with that background blur. On things like iOS, it's gonna be a little bit easier to implement. They do have a CSS filter, so you can use the blur on the web, but not every browser is gonna support it. You'll have to do a lot of testing. So the background blur on this, like I said, it's really similar to the iOS modals, where it gives you the alert and the several different buttons. Sometimes even the buttons on the modal might have a little bit of blur, so, or maybe a little bit of opacity. So they have, maybe your main call to action is right here, and then your cancel button is the same color as your main, but it's reduced down a lot to 20 or 30% because you want to bring in some of that blurry color that might be coming in. So there's almost an endless variety of ways that you can combine opacity and blur with these overlays. And you can even put an overlay on top of this background image. All right, so let's do a solid black, and we'll do it at like 10%. And whatever you put on the background is going to be affected by this thing. So the black is going to start to bleed in, and maybe that doesn't work quite as well. Maybe you need a white version, you know, so there's whatever you put on that background is going to start bleeding through in this shape right here. So you just kind of have to play around with the blur, but it's really easy to go too over the top on this. I would definitely recommend just starting with simple 10% reduction in black or a 10% black overlay, and just go very, very small increments. If you go blur the background, add an overlay, blur the modal, it's gonna feel very gimmicky. You can already tell the way this one that I just created it feels a little gimmicky. So I'm actually gonna change that. Especially imagine if I added a background blur or a layer blur on top of this as well. You can definitely go over the top, and just too many things happening at once, it's not gonna work that well. So that's kind of what I just did here with combining blur and opacity. So I'll go ahead and get rid of that and say, be careful. So for blur and opacity homework, I think if you want to dig into this file and try to recreate a couple of these examples, I think one of the best examples would be using an avatar, playing around with the border, and have a bit of text with some alert buttons that you could create a modal, and you can experiment with some of these background images, some of the gradient overlays, or the reduction in text opacity. So I would just choose one or two of these, maybe with the map, maybe with the avatar, and recreate these on your own, but make sure you focus heavily on the subtle opacity background that you're using, or the subtle opacity on the secondary button, and the subtle blur amount, and kind of play around with a few different ranges and try to get to something that you feel works well. And it kind of expose you to some of these techniques that you might not have tried before. So you decide which one you want to take, and best of luck to you.